Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. She wasn't supposed to be a bride. She wasn't even supposed to be a woman yet. The year was 1911, deep in the rolling backwoods of Appalachia, where the mountains cast long shadows and the law was as thin as the air in winter. They said Clara Whitford was promised, spoken for, before she even had her first birthday. By the time she was 9, her fate had already been sealed, not to a stranger, but to a cousin more than twice her age. And in that valley, this was not seen as a scandal. It was seen as tradition. The photographs that remain are few, but they are haunting. A girl with the hollow cheeks of malnutrition, a ribbon in her hair that had been passed down from sister to sister, cousin to cousin. The dress she wore was not white, but an old yellowing thing pulled from a trunk in the attic. And beside her, a man whose face was lined not just by age, but by a kind of hunger, an ancient, unbroken hunger that had been fed the same way for generations. Inbreeding in these hills was not whispered about. It was woven into the bloodlines. Families doubled back on themselves so many times that the family tree had stopped branching. And in Clara's case, her own parents were already dangerously close in relation. Some say this wedding was not just the union of two people, but the continuation of a closed loop, a loop that had already produced children who could not walk straight, who could not speak without a slur, who were doomed to live and die within a few miles of where they were born. The town's preacher said it was God's will. The families said it was keeping the blood pure. Outsiders rarely came up the dirt road that led to her father's cabin. No, but when they did, they knew better than to ask questions. In these parts, questions could disappear you. And so Clara became a wife before she could even read. She cooked for him. She washed his clothes in the cold creek. And she learned, far too soon, that the bedroom door was not a place she could refuse to enter. This was her life, until the day something happened that would set the whole hollow whispering. Clara's world was no bigger than the hollow she was born into. The mountains closed her in like walls, and the people inside them seemed bound by the same unwritten code, one that put family above all else, even when family meant something twisted. Her husband, Elijah Whitford, was not only her cousin, but a man who had grown up under the same roof as her mother for a time. In truth, his claim to her began long before she could understand what it meant. Elijah was 32 when Clara was married to him. To him, she was an inheritance, not a partner. His family had spent decades trading daughters between cousins to keep land and names from drifting into the hands of outsiders. Every few years, the Whitfords would host a gathering, not unlike a wedding fair, where young girls were paired off with men already chosen for them. It was during one of these gatherings, when Clara was barely walking, that her future was decided with a handshake between men whose blood already ran too close. The Whitford bloodline was notorious even among neighboring hollows. Their eyes, people said, held a far-off look, and some of their children bore strange defects, fingers that fused together, jaws that grew crooked, minds that never seemed to fully wake. But instead of being shamed, these traits became almost a badge of belonging. To be pure Whitford was to carry the proof of it in your bones. Clara didn't know any of this when she was small. All she knew was that Elijah's presence was constant. He would bring her small trinkets carved from wood, teach her how to carry water from the spring, and correct her if she forgot to call him sir. By the time she was 8, he had already moved into her family's cabin, claiming it was so he could look after her. By the time she was 9, the preacher was called, and a Bible was placed in her trembling hands. There was no courtship, no escape. And certainly no consent. The women in her family told her it was her duty. They said it with tight smiles and voices that trembled only when the men weren't in earshot. And though Clara did not yet have the words for it, a cold dread began to grow in her that would never leave her, not even decades later. It was this dread that made her notice something others ignored. There were things about Elijah's past that were never spoken of. Whispers about his first wife. Whispers about what had happened to her. And the deeper Clara looked, the more she realized This marriage had been written in blood long before she was born. Clara first heard about Elijah's first wife on a winter evening when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire in the hearth had burned down to a dim, reddish glow. Her grandmother was mending a quilt, her fingers moving quick through faded cloth, when she said it without looking up. "You're his second." The words were almost swallowed by the creak of the rocking chair, but Clara caught them. Second? No one had told her there was a first. When she asked who the first was, the old woman's eyes flicked toward the door and then back to her needle. "Best you don't ask." That was the last she said on the matter. But Clara was young, and in the silence of those mountain nights, a question like that doesn't fade, it grows. Over the next months, she pieced together fragments. The first wife had been a Whitford too, Elijah's cousin on the other side of the ridge. Some said she had been sickly, others claimed she was made that way. And then, one autumn, she was gone. No one spoke of a funeral, no one marked her grave. People who lived closest to Elijah's homestead whispered she had run into the woods and never returned. Others, in voices lowered to almost nothing, suggested she hadn't left at all, that she was buried somewhere behind the barn, in soil so churned by roots and stones that nothing would grow there. The strangest part was how Elijah carried himself after she was gone. He never wore mourning clothes. He never spoke her name. It was as though she had never existed, and yet he was quick to claim Clara soon after. Too quick, perhaps, as if the loss of one bride was simply an inconvenience to be remedied. In the Whitford Hollow, no one challenged Elijah. He was quiet, but there was something in his silence that kept people from crossing him. Some believed the land itself belonged to him, that he could decide who stayed and who left. The fact that he chose Clara, barely 9 years old, was never questioned aloud. But to Clara, it began to feel like a sentence handed down before she could even defend herself. In the stillness of their cabin, Elijah sometimes stared at her in a way that made her skin crawl, measuring, appraising, as though she were livestock he had bought too soon but would still fatten for slaughter. And in those moments, she began to fear that whatever had happened to his first wife might one day happen to her. The spring after her wedding, Clara began to see the hollow with new eyes. She noticed things she hadn't before, things the grown-ups either didn't see or pretended not to. Elijah's homestead sat apart from the others, its barn leaning under the weight of years, the boards weathered to a dull grey. Behind it, the ground sloped toward a patch of earth where the grass grew thinner, weaker, like it was struggling against something buried beneath. Clara had heard the stories about that patch of earth, but she didn't need stories to know there was truth in them. Elijah kept her close, rarely letting her go farther than the edge of the property. When she did wander, she would find other Whitford women, faces drawn and tired, hanging laundry or carrying buckets from the creek. They would glance at her, but they never smiled. There was a heaviness in their eyes, a kind of knowledge that made them look older than they were. Clara started to understand. They were all trapped in the same way, born into it, bound by it. And none of them had escaped. On Sundays, Elijah took her to the small clapboard church down the ridge. The preacher would speak of obedience, of a woman's duty to her husband, of keeping the family line pure. Clara noticed that in this church there were no real strangers. Every face was somehow connected, every family tied to the next by blood. The children looked alike, the men looked alike. It was a congregation of mirrors, and in that sameness, Clara began to feel suffocated. One day, while she was gathering eggs in the chicken coop, an older woman approached her quietly. Her name was Hester, a cousin many times removed, or maybe not removed at all. She leaned in, her voice just a whisper. "You mind yourself with him, girl." Clara froze. "Why?" she asked. Hester's eyes darted toward the barn and then back to Clara. "Because you remind him of the first one." And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving Clara alone with her basket and a pounding heart. From that moment on, Clara could not stop thinking about the first wife. She imagined her footsteps across the same dirt, her hands working the same chores, her eyes catching the same glances from Elijah. And she imagined, too, the moment she vanished, whether it was into the woods or into the earth. The hollow, had its rules. And Clara was beginning to understand that the most dangerous one was this. When a Whitford wife disappears, no one asks where she went. By midsummer, Clara had begun to feel the weight of her marriage pressing down in ways she could no longer ignore. The house was small, yet Elijah's presence filled every corner, every breath. He moved through rooms without a sound, watching her with eyes that rarely blinked. At night, the silence was worse than any noise. The creak of the floorboards beneath his steps became a language she understood too well, telling her when he was near, when he was coming to her room, when the door would open whether she wanted it to or not. Her body was still a child's, but in Elijah's mind, she was his wife in every way that word meant in the hollow. There was no space for refusal, no thought of boundaries. The Whitford women had been raised to believe their husband's will was law, and Clara was no different. But inside her, a part of her still resisted, quietly, secretly. She hid her defiance in small ways, taking longer to finish chores, slipping away to the creek just to feel the cold water numb her hands, standing in the far corner of the barn so she could watch the road. One evening, a summer storm rolled in fast, the kind that turned the dirt road into a river of red clay. The wind tore at the shingles, rain hammered the tin roof, and in the middle of it all, Elijah stood at the window, staring toward the tree line. Clara followed his gaze and thought she saw movement, just a shadow slipping between the trunks. When she asked who it was, Elijah didn't answer. He only muttered, "Ain't no one supposed to be out there." His tone was flat, but there was something in it that made her skin prickle. Later that night, after the storm had passed and Elijah had gone to bed, Clara crept to the window. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, and there, just beyond the barn, she saw it. A faint glimmer of lantern light, moving slowly along the slope toward that patch of bare earth. And she couldn't see who was carrying it, but the sight of it made her chest tighten. In the days that followed, she began to hear more whispers about digging in the middle of the night, about bones found years ago on the edge of the property, about the fact that Elijah's first wife wasn't the only woman to vanish in the Whitford Hollow. And for the first time, Clara began to wonder if she was not simply a bride, but the next name in a long unspoken list. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The summer air hung thick and heavy in the hollow, but for Clara Whitford, it was more than the heat that made it hard to breathe. She had begun to notice patterns in Elijah's life, rituals he kept without fail. Some were harmless, like sharpening his pocket knife at the same time every evening or whittling little sticks into points while he sat on the porch. But others were darker. Every month, on a night when the moon was little more than a sliver, he would leave the cabin after supper and not return until near dawn. He never told her where he went. If she asked, his jaw would tighten and he'd say, "Tend to your own business." But Clara couldn't help noticing that these nights often came after he had been short-tempered, after he had paced the rooms like a restless dog. One of those nights, she waited until she heard his boots fade down the dirt path. Then she slipped from her bed, careful not to wake the loose floorboard near the door, and crept outside. The moonlight painted everything in shades of grey. She followed the sound of his steps just far enough to see him veer toward the barn. Through a gap in the boards, she saw him light a lantern and set it near the back wall. He bent down, and in his hands was a shovel. The metal scraped against the packed earth, slow and steady. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if he was burying something or digging something up. She backed away, afraid the sound of her heartbeat would give her away, and slipped into the shadows until she was safe inside the cabin again. But she didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. In her mind, she saw the patch of bare earth behind the barn, the same one the grass refused to grow over. By morning, Elijah was back to his usual quiet self. Sitting at the table with his coffee as though nothing had happened. But Clara noticed the dirt under his fingernails. She noticed the smell of freshly turned soil clinging to his boots. And she knew, whatever secret the Whitford men had buried back there, it was never meant to be found. The thought stayed with her deep in her bones, and for the first time she began to think about something dangerous, what it would take to get away. Clara began to test the edges of her world. It started with small rebellions, lingering longer than she should by the creek, pretending not to hear Elijah when he called her name, wandering past the line of sycamores that marked the edge of their land. She knew if she pushed too far, the consequences would come swift and hard, but the thought of escape had rooted itself in her mind like a stubborn weed. She began to watch the road more closely. Few outsiders ever came through the hollow, but sometimes a peddler with a mule cart would pass by, or a man from the county would ride through on business. Clara imagined stepping out in front of one of them, telling them what she knew, what she suspected, but she didn't even know the words to explain it. How do you tell someone that your marriage is a cage built generations before you were born, that the people who raised you had decided your fate before you could walk? One afternoon, as she was fetching water from the spring, she saw Hester again, the same older cousin who had once warned her to be careful. This time, Hester's face was harder, her eyes darting over Clara's shoulder as though she feared being seen. She pressed a folded scrap of paper into Clara's hand and whispered, "Don't read it here, hide it. And whatever you do, don't let him see it." Clara slipped it into her apron and finished her chores with her heart pounding. That night, after Elijah had gone to bed, she unfolded it under the faint glow of the oil lamp. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "He buried her where the earth won't grow. You ain't safe. Don't wait till the frost." There was no signature, but Clara didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was about, and she understood the warning well enough. It wasn't just the first wife who had met her end here. Others had. The next morning, Elijah seemed to watch her more closely than usual. Maybe he had seen her hide the note. Maybe he simply sensed the change in her, the way she was holding herself tighter, her eyes darting toward the road when she thought he wasn't looking. The hollow had always been a place where secrets didn't stay buried forever, but for Clara, the question was no longer whether she could learn the truth. It was whether she could survive it. The first frost came early that year, dusting the ridgetops in white while the hollows below still clung to the damp smell of fallen leaves. Clara felt the change in the air like a clock ticking down. Every warning, every whisper, every shadow behind the barn weighed heavier now. She knew winter in the Whitford Hollow was long and cruel, and that whatever Elijah had planned for her, it would happen before the thaw. One grey afternoon, Elijah told her they'd be taking a walk after supper. His voice was flat, but the way he stared at her told her this was not a request. She tried to keep her hands from shaking as she ladled stew into his bowl. Every bite he took felt like another turn of the key in a lock she couldn't see. When night fell, he lit a lantern and told her to follow. They walked past the barn, past the fence, to that bare patch of earth she'd been warned about. The ground was half frozen, but the grass was still dead there, brittle under her shoes. Elijah stopped, resting the lantern on a stump, and for a long moment, he just looked at her. "You're a Whitford wife now," he said, his voice low and strange. "And Whitford wives, they keep their place." He didn't move toward her, not yet. He only reached into his coat and pulled out the small folding knife she'd seen him sharpen 100 times. In the flicker of lantern light, the blade seemed almost too bright, too sharp against the cold dark. Clara's mind was screaming for her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the frozen soil. She thought about Hester's warning, about the note, about the first wife and the others whose names were never spoken. She thought about the lantern she had seen moving here months before, and she knew this was how it ended for them. But before Elijah could take a step closer, a sound cut through the night. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming down the slope. Elijah turned, and Clara saw figures emerging from the dark. 3 men, 2 holding rifles, 1 carrying a shovel. She recognized them. Whitfords. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Told you to keep your mouth shut," he muttered, not to her, but toward the men. No one spoke after that. The men just stood there, the shovel catching the lantern light, the cold air pressing in around them. And in that frozen, breathless moment, Clara realized something even worse than she'd imagined. These men weren't here to save her. They were here to help him. And that was the last thing anyone in the Hollow ever said about Clara Whitford.